Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 5 and the second of 3 lessons on using master pages to create digital planners and journals in Affinity Publisher for iPad. In this lesson, we're going to expand on what we covered in the first one and use master pages to create a closed version of our planner cover. I've included chapter markers below so that you can jump around or refer back whenever needed. If you haven't already watched the first in this series, I do recommend starting there, and I've linked to that one below. Are you ready? Let's get started. In the last lesson, I had set up 2 master pages and added guides and margins to the open version of the planner. Off camera, I saved it as a template so that I can pull in a new copy whenever I want to start a new planner from scratch. You can save a template by going up to the Documents menu and choosing Export as Template. From there, you'll save it like any other file. When I'm ready to use the template, I can either go to New and choose New from Template, or I can go right down to the Templates button, choose this AF template file, and it's going to pull in a fresh copy, leaving the original one intact. In other words, anything I add to this will only be to this copy. Now in this document, I had set up a single master page for the closed cover, so I'm going to make sure that I have that selected. I'll go to my Pages panel and Masters and tap to select that, and you can see it has the gray box around it. Remember, it's always a good idea to actively select the page or master page that you want to add to before you start adding anything. Now, this cover isn't going to include content like calendars or other grids, and it's going to be a single page in the planner. So I'm going to focus on using textures along with shadows and highlights to really drive home the realistic feel. The aim is to use enough for realism, but not so much that the planner becomes so large that I can't compress it down to a workable size for GoodNotes, Noteful, or other annotation apps. Now, one additional note, when I create planners, I work non-destructively wherever possible, and I create everything in modules that are either saved as templates or assets to my Assets panel. There are a couple of benefits to doing it this way. The first is the iPad is convenient in that it allows you to create on the go, but it's not without its challenges and limitations, both from a size perspective and just the nature of being a mobile app. There are certain things the iPad can't do when it comes to creating planners, data merge being one of them. By saving what I create as templates and assets, I can quickly create a variety of planners just by opening up a template, making changes to the colors, texture, whatever I want to change, and I don't have to start from scratch. For example, the planner background I'll be creating over the next 2 lessons will look like a bound book. So this is the outside, and this is what the inside is going to look like. But all of the shading on the outside and inside will be non-destructive, so it can easily be turned off and replaced with outer and inner coils, vintage-inspired book plates, snaps. Don't worry, I have lessons on creating all of those. Taking this approach allows you to work more efficiently because you're not having to start over each time. You're creating once, and the more efficiently you work, the more time you'll have to create more things. Another benefit is that template formatting is universal, not only between the Affinity apps on the same machine, but between the Affinity apps on the iPad and desktop. Additionally, assets can be exported and used as many times as you'd like, and you can use them on both the iPad and desktop. This is really helpful when I want to create a larger, more detailed, dated planner using data merge, but I don't want to have to start all over again on the desktop creating the shell of my planner. Because I'll be honest, I don't create full dated planners on my iPad. It would take far too long to create just a single planner. If I'm going to create a complete planner or journal here on the iPad, it's going to be a basic undated one or a notebook with hyperlinked sections. But creating individual modules on the iPad and pulling a full planner together on the desktop using data merge is really easy. We'll talk more about templates and assets throughout the series, but for now, let's start creating the cover. I want this to look like a closed book sitting on a wood desktop. So I'm going to bring in a stock image of wood from the stock studio. I'm just going to key in wood, and there's a particular one that I like in the pixels category. I'll just pull this one in. And this is going to be a little bit too large for the canvas here, but I'm going to make it large enough that it covers. You're not going to see a whole lot because the actual planner is going to be sitting on top, but where it does show through, I want some interesting elements that aren't distracting. So I like this knot here on the left. I'm just going to make sure it's over here. And then I'm going to use the vector cropped tool over here to crop this into the canvas because I have way too much and I don't want anything hanging off. So when you use the vector crop tool, which also crops images, by the way, you'll get these handles on the top bottom, and sides. And I'm just going to pull this in until it snaps to the canvas. And I'll do the same here and here. And if you need to, you can always pull in too far, and then you can see if you're snapping to the right place. What that does is creates a mask. So it's still there if I need to move this around, but it's all cropped into the canvas. I'm going to go ahead and name this. It's always a good idea to name your layers, especially when you're creating something complex like a planner. So I'll call this desktop. And I want to lock this in place so I don't move it around as I'm adding the other elements. So I'll just swipe to the right and choose lock. Next, I want to start building the cover itself. So I'm going to select my rectangle tool. The color doesn't matter right now, but I'm going to drag out a rectangle that covers the entire canvas. And the reason that I'm doing it this way is I know this is letter size. So it's going to give me the aspect ratio that I want for the planner. It's going to look more natural. But obviously I need to scale this down. So I'm going to select it with my move tool. And I have my command controller open down here at the bottom. If you don't, just go up to the Documents menu and toggle on Command Controller. I'll go ahead and run my finger so that I'm covering both Shift and Command, and I'm just going to drag in a little bit. I don't need a lot of the desktop showing through, but I also want to make sure that this is small enough that when I want to add binder rings, I can do that. So I'll go ahead and select that again. I can also run past this so it locks those into place and I don't have to keep my finger on it. For the planner I'm creating here, I'm going to keep it in the middle, but I'm going to be creating another master page in an upcoming lesson where I can move this over to make room for the binder rings that I'm going to create. But for right now, I'll keep it right there. I feel like that knot's not really showing through, but I'm going to leave that as is. I'll tap to turn these off, and now I can start adding to the cover. The first thing I want to do is round this off a little bit. It's a little bit too harsh on the corners. So I'm going to select the rectangle tool and go up here to the top and choose round. Now 25% is too much. I find that between 2 and 5% works really well. So I'll go ahead and change this to, I think, 2. That looks good. It's just rounded off enough that it doesn't look too harsh. I'm going to lock this into place because if I leave this as is, anytime I scale this, if I need to, it's going to continue to scale the corners. So I'm going to go up to the top and tap on Convert to Curves. And you can see it adds 2 nodes on each corner to make those curves. I'm going to add a solid color to this. I could always change it to a pattern or something like that, but I'm going to go with, I think, this red fill. I don't need a stroke, so I'm just going to swipe up on that. I want to add a fabric texture to this. I'm going to use a fabric texture from texturelabs.org, and I've linked to the site below. They have tons of amazing free textures that you can use for both personal and commercial projects in all sorts of categories. It's where I get most of my textures from. So I'm going to choose the Place tool, and mine are in my files. You can also save it to the photos. And I have mine set up as a separate file. This is actually a linked file. I'm going to link in all of my textures instead of embedding them in this case. Now I'm going to choose this Texture Lab Fabrics 122. So I'll go ahead and tap and choose Open, and then just drag this out. I'm going to bring it out pretty far. The reason I like this texture, it has all those little realistic pills there. So I'm going to clip this inside instead of cropping it this time. I think I might just crop this in to here at least. And I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay. It's going to give it a nice pop of color with that red as well as show the texture. I can always change the opacity if I want or try out a different blend mode, but I like this, so I'm going to leave this as is for right now. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you how to make a few different elements for the covers of your planners, things like vintage-inspired book plates, leather spine covers and snaps, and binder rings. For this particular lesson, I'm going to keep things simple and just create a simple fabric band for the right side. So I'll select my rectangle again. I'm going to deselect this guy, and I'm just going to drag out a rectangle. And I don't actually want it to sit flush with the planner, because if this was actually a fabric band, it would be going over and wrapping under the book. So having it sit flush wouldn't look natural. I'm just going to bring it up slightly here and then go down to the bottom and do the same thing. And I also want to round this off slightly. So I'll go up to the top, choose round, and I'm going to go with maybe 3. I think that looks good. I'm going to be adding shadows and highlights to this to help with that wrapping over and under, but for right now, I'm going to call this one done. I want to add some fabric texture to it, but I don't need to grab that again. I'm just going to go right to my Texture Labs fabric here. I'll hold my finger down, copy, select that, and I'm going to go ahead and paste and just clip it inside. Now I also need to change the color. I'm going to go to my palette here, and I think I'll go with this peach color. And I might make this a little bit wider. So I'm going to select my Move tool. And with my Command controller, I'm going to hold down Command and just drag this out. And I want to make sure I actually have the band selected. I had the texture selected there. So make sure that the rounded rectangle is selected and just drag out. Finally, before I move on to the shadows and highlights, I want to add a cutout in the cover, or what looks like one, where someone could either place typed info about the planner or write it in. My final planner, if you saw before, is going to have a vintage-inspired book plate that looks like this one. Again, I'm going to show you how to create that in a separate lesson. But for now, I want to show you a different option when you want to keep it a little bit more simple. So I'll grab my rectangle, and I'm going to use an off-white color for this because that's going to be the color of the paper. And just drag out a short, wide rectangle. Now I want to round this up. So I'll go ahead to the top here. And in this case, 25% works actually pretty well. So I'll just go ahead and convert that to a curve and lock it in. And I'm going to move it to right about here. Now I want to add some paper texture to this. So I'm going to go to my Stock Studio and key in Craft Paper. And there's one in the Pexels category by Resource Boy that I use all the time. Just bring this in. It's going to come in much bigger than I need it, but that's okay. I'm going to either crop it in if I want to, or I can just scale it down. So I'm going to go to my Transform panel. I want to lock the aspect ratio. And I'm also going to make sure that my anchor is set to the middle here. That's going to scale everything in from the center. And I can just drag down on one side or the other until it's where I want. So I'm going to bring it right about there. And then I'll hold Shift down, and I'm just going to rotate this. Now what I want is to first clip this inside of this shape, but I want to get rid of the brown parts of it. I want only the little gritty details that make it look like paper. And I'm going to do that two ways. The first is I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. What that's doing is leaving the texture, but it's starting to pull that off-white color through. Adding texture to light colors can be somewhat tricky because it's difficult to get the texture to show up. So I'm going to start with this, but I also want to go into blend options to pull the darkest parts of the craft paper out and blend them with the off-white square. Now that I've changed the blend mode, with that selected, I'm going to go to the layer options, the ellipsis up here at the top, and I want to go down to the bottom to these two grids. And I specifically want the one on the left that's called Source. This is the layer I have selected. Now, on the left side is any of the dark parts of that layer. On the right side is any of the light ones. Now remember, I want to leave everything, I want to remove everything but the darkest parts. So I want to start dragging down on the right side so that the dark parts are remaining, but I'm starting to see that off-white come through. And if I feel like I brought too much out, I can always pull this back up. The other thing I can do is I can pull this to this side to bring in some of the midtones and make it look a little grittier. This is non-destructive, so I can always go back in and change it as much as I want. Now, I'm not going to go into further detail on how blend options work in this video, but I do have a full tutorial on using them to create textural illustrations, and I'll link that in the description. I think this looks good as is, so while I'm here, I'm just going to name this. This is paper texture, and I'll go ahead and name this one as well. This is going to be label, and I'll name the rest off of camera. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and start adding some of the shadows and highlights. I want to add shading and highlights to the cover both along the spine as well as adding a drop shadow to the bottom of it. I'm also going to add some highlights and shadows to the top and bottom using the FX Studio. Let's start with those as well as the drop shadows because those are the easiest. So I have my cover layer selected, and that's what I want to add the drop shadow to. I'm going to go to the FX Studio and I'll toggle on outer shadow, and then tap to get the contextual menu. Now, when you're adding shadow, you always want to think about which direction you want your light source to come from. You decide that. And then make sure that any shadows or highlights you add follow that direction. I'm going to create mine as if it's coming from the top left with a little bit coming from the center left. And that means that all of my shadows are going to fall down and to the right. Another thing that you want to think about is what the shadow would look like in real life. So, in other words, for this planner, this is a closed book, which means it's all the pages and both the front and back cover. So my drop shadow here needs to be pretty deep. On the iPad, I don't have to use a slider for my offset. I'm just going to tap and I'll start dragging down and to the right. Shadows and highlights are one of those things that when you're trying to create for realism, if they're off even slightly, the person that's looking at them may not know why it's wrong. They just know something's wrong. So it's always a good idea to check all of your shadows and highlights to make sure that they're following the way they should. So I'm going to bring this to right about here, and then I'll go to this second slider and bring the radius up. Now, in looking at this, you may notice that this still doesn't look right, even with the drop shadow. And one of the things that I notice when it comes to people adding drop shadows is they always forget the top left one. If you're looking at something top down, it's not going to be completely flat here unless it's somehow bent down and to the left. This one isn't. So I want to add a little bit of a drop shadow to the top left. I'm going to go back into my FX Studio. I don't have to start fresh. I'm just going to make sure I select that and hit outer shadow. It's going to add a duplicate of what I already put in place, and then I can just bring this up and to the left slightly, bring the radius down a little bit, and maybe even bring the opacity down a bit. So now it's showing it lifted up on the top left side as well as the bottom right, but again, the majority of the shadow is down here because my light's coming from here. So one final thing I want to do there is change this to scale with object. That way, if I change the scale of this, the shadow is going to scale with it. With my drop shadow in place, I'm going to add a 3D effect to the book just to add a slight highlight to the top and a bit of a shadow to the bottom. So I'll go ahead and toggle on 3D. And I'm going to tap to get the contextual menu for that. You always want to make sure that you do that because if you noticed, it still had the contextual menu for the outer shadow, which meant if I started making changes, it's going to change the outer shadow instead of the 3D. So just toggle on and off and tap to make sure you have the right contextual menu. Now, one of the first things you might notice is that my highlight is over here and to the right. And that actually doesn't make sense because if my shadows fall down and to the right, my light source is coming from here. I need a highlight here. That's called azimuth. So I'm going to go down to the bottom here and I'm going to tap on these icons until I get azimuth. What I want to do is drag this up. And as I do that, you can see that the highlight is shifting. And once it gets to this top left corner, that's where I want it. So this is about 135. A third thing that you want to consider when you're adding shadows and highlights is what is the actual texture that you're adding it to? If I were adding this to something like metal, this really harsh light would be just fine. It's kind of tight and it would be perfect because it's a shiny object. This is fabric though, and fabric absorbs light, so it's going to be slightly diffused. So what I want to do is I want to tap until I get softened down here at the bottom, and I'm going to bring that up. Another thing that I want to do is tap until I get specular and just bring that down a little bit. I'm just muting it a touch. I could also bring up the radius slightly, but I want to be careful because if you bring this radius up too much, it looks way too rounded and this does not look real. So I'm going to bring that down to right about there. I think that looks good. So you can see it added a highlight here and here, and it's also added a shadow down on the bottom and the right side. The next thing I want to do is add some drop shadow to the fabric band here. So I'll go to my layers and choose that. I could technically copy the effects here and add it to that, but it's going to be much too big. So it's just as easy just to start over again. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle on outer shadow, and then I'll go ahead and tap to get the contextual menu for it. And in this case, this is a much thinner object. This is not a thick planner. It's just a thin piece of fabric. So I'm going to bring the offset to the right slightly and bring the radius up. but I want to bring the radius up enough that it starts to peek through the left side as well. And maybe bring the offset just a little bit more. If I bring it too far, it's going to look like it's floating, and that's not what I want. So I really want to be careful how much I add to that. I don't want to use a 3D effect on my fabric band. I don't think it works well. What I want to do instead is use two shapes that are gradients. One is going to add a highlight to the top. The other is going to add a very slight shadow to the bottom that's going to give the impression of it wrapping around. I'm not really sure why the 3D effect doesn't work as well. I think part of it is because it makes this part look way too flat or too rounded, depending on the radius. I just find it's a better approach to do it this way. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and I'm going to select white and drag out a rectangle. I'll go ahead and duplicate that, and I'm going to turn that to mid-tone gray. So that's in the quick colors right here. I'll go ahead and take both of these and I'm going to clip them inside the fabric band. And I'll just rename these real quick. So this one is shadow, and this one is going to be highlight. And what I want to do is take this one, I'm going to turn this one off for right now, but I'm going to change the blend mode of it to soft light. This one is the one I'm going to work on first. So I have this set to mid-tone gray, and I want to set the blend mode to linear burn. And the reason that I do this is because unlike multiply set to pure black, I find that mid-tone gray set to linear burn pulls the color that it's sitting on top of so that you get a more natural shadow than you would if you're using pure black and multiply. So I need to change this to a gradient rather than a solid fill. I'll grab my gradient tool and I want to start from the top and go down. The reason I'm doing that is because it's always going to add the lightest part to the top to wherever I start and the darkest part to where I want to end. And I want the shadow at the bottom. So the very first thing I'm going to do is tap to select the color stop at the top. I'll go to my colors, and in my HSL sliders, I'm going to bring the luminance all the way up and the opacity all the way down. I want to get rid of any color that's in there because I want the original color to come through that, and I'll leave that alone. I want to push this shadow down so that it's at the very edge. The very first thing I'm going to do is take this mid-range slider and drag it down. The next thing I want to do is I want to add another color stop here. And I'm going to change the luminance and opacity so that it sort of pushes that shadow down even more. And this is one of those things you just sort of play with it until it's where you want it. And then I can also take the mid-range slider between these two and just push it right there. I want it to be feathered, but I don't want it to be so feathered that it's like that. And then I'm just going to go back to my layers and bring the opacity down. This is just supposed to be a subtle shadow that gives the impression of it wrapping around the bottom. I can always come back and change that, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and call that done and work on the highlight. So I'll go ahead and turn that on. And I've already changed the blend mode, so it's got some of that peach color peeking through. I'm going to go ahead and grab my gradient tool, and again, I'll start top down. Now this time, I'm going to turn off all the color on the bottom one. So I'm going to bring that all the way down in this case because I'm putting it over a dark color, and bring the opacity down. I want to lock this up as far as I can go because I want the natural color to come through there. This is just supposed to be a highlight. I'm going to add another stop right there. I'll just move that mid-tone slider, so let's push that back up here. All right, that's as far as that'll go. I'm going to zoom in because you can't really see it, but it's the mid-tone slider is kind of hiding there. I'm going to move this down. And again, I need to adjust the color on this one until I get something that's pushing that highlight to the top. So let's bring that, I'll keep this up to 100%, but I'm going to bring the luminance down a little bit. And I can always pull this in just a touch. The other thing that you can do is if you feel like it's too harsh, you can add a Gaussian blur to it. I think this is fine in this case, but if you want to, you can diffuse it a little bit with a Gaussian blur. So I want to go ahead and just drop the opacity on this a little bit. It's just supposed to be subtle. The band is done. I'll call that done for right now. I kind of feel like the color is a little too close to the red, but I'm going to leave that alone for right now and move on to the label. Now, the thing about the label is this isn't a real cutout. So if I were to add a drop shadow to this, so if I tap and add it, it's going to add it underneath it, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I'll turn that off. Instead, I want this to look like the shadows on the inside of the box. So I'm going to use inner shadow. I'll go ahead and tap and get the contextual menu. And I want this to follow the same as the other shadows. So I'm going to pull this down. Now this is just on the cover. It's a thinner thing than the actual planner. So I don't want to pull it out too far. It's going to look unnatural. I'll pull it out to right about there and just pull the radius up. But again, I need something for this side as well. So I'll go back to the FX Studio. I'm going to tap the plus sign and then just bring it up from the bottom right slightly. And I want to make sure that scale with object is on all of the effects that I just added, just in case I have to scale it up and down. That way everything will scale with it. All of the shadows and highlights are in place using the FX Studio. At this point, I'm ready to start adding the shadows and highlights along the spine. I'm going to use the gradient tool to add highlights and shadows to the spine, giving it the impression of an indent as if it's been opened a few times. In an upcoming lesson, I'm going to show you how to make binder rings for the inside and outside so that you have options. For this particular planner on this master page, I'm going to create the shading on the outside, and the corresponding master page for the inside will have bound pages. So just like with the fabric band, I want to add 2 rectangles to this. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and select white, and I'll go ahead and drag that out. I'll just duplicate that one, and I'm going to change that to gray. And I want to select both of these and clip them inside the cover. So I'm dragging it down and to the right and clipping it inside. So for this first one, I'm going to change the blend mode to soft light. And I'll go ahead and turn that off for right now. For this one, I want this to be linear burn, just like the fabric band. And I'm going to select the gradient tool, hold my finger down on shift on the command key and just drag out a straight linear gradient. That's going to add the left side in the color I started with, and the right side is going to be slightly down on the luminance scale. On this right side, I don't want any color whatsoever. So I'm going to bring the luminance up and the opacity down. That's going to let that original color come through. For right now, I'm going to keep this guy the way he is, but I want to create a color stop that's going to act as the crease. And then I want to create what I call gatekeeper color stops for either side. So they're going to kind of lock it into place. I'm going to move that right about here, and then I'll tap to add 2 on either side. I might need to add more, but that's where I'm going to start. So I'll select this middle one, whichever one is active is the largest one. I'll go to my HSL sliders, and I'm going to bring the luminance down. I don't want to bring it down so far that it looks like it's really deep. I'm going to bring it to maybe about 34, 35, and I'll bring the opacity up. So this is why I need the gatekeeper. You can see this is kind of spreading itself out. So I'm going to take this one, and I think I'll move the luminance down and the opacity all the way down. Just play with this. Move that right about there. And then for this one, go ahead and bring the opacity down and the luminance up. Sometimes it helps to back up. I feel like this is too rounded. I don't like the rounded side here. Part of it is because this needs to come this direction so that it's locking this shadow to the very edge. I want it to look more flat than rounded. And I'm going to bring the luminance of that down just a bit. I might also bring the opacity down just a touch. I think the crease is too dark. So I'm going to go back in and select that and maybe bring that just up a touch to right about there. I'll go to my layers, and I'm going to bring the opacity of the entire thing down just a bit. I can always change it once I add the highlights, but I'll leave that right about there. And I'm going to turn this one on, and once again, grab my gradient tool. I'll hold shift down and drag out a linear gradient. Make sure that you have the layer selected. Once again, I don't want anything on this right side. So I'm going to bring the luminance up and the opacity down. I'm going to set a color stop there. Then I'm going to bring all the way down. And then this time I want to create 2 that aren't going to act as color stops. They're actually going to be my highlight. So I have this one selected. I'm going to bring the luminance up and the opacity up. Now you can see it's spreading itself this way, so I need a gatekeeper for this one. I'll go ahead and lock that, bring that down. And I'm gonna do the same thing on this side. I'll bring the luminance up and the opacity up, and then lock it in place there. So I'll bring this down and this down. And let's just bring this way. For this guy, I want to get rid of it completely. I don't want it to color the shadow at all. So I'm going to bring the opacity on that all the way down and bring the luminance down. The highlights look good. They're just a little too harsh. So I'll go back to my layers and just bring the opacity down. Remember, this is fabric, so they're going to diffuse a little bit. I'm just going to step back and take a look. I think this looks good. I don't think it looks too deep. I could always move everything over if I wanted to, but I like how that looks. I think this looks nice and flat, and this is giving the impression of it being rounded. There's really no set numbers to use here with either of these gradients. It completely comes down to what you're trying to create. All of the settings are non-destructive, so you can easily come into either one and adjust them if you don't like the overall look. With the book in place and all of the shading and highlights done, one last thing I'm going to do is pull in a PNG of a pencil that I created. I want to use this as a clickable link either to take me to a particular point in the planner or even to an external website. I'll be sharing a series of videos as part of this series on how to create various elements for your digital planners, including this one, but for now, I'm going to pull one in that I already created. So I'll just key in pencil, grab this guy, and just drag it out. And I'm going to bring it right about here and tilt it, maybe make it a little bit bigger. And I want to add a drop shadow to this. Again, this is something that would be rather deep. So I'll go ahead to my FX, grab my outer shadow and toggle that on. And I'm going to bring the offset down and to the right. And then bring that radius up. And then finally, I need to make sure that I save this because remember, I pulled this in as a template, which means this is a clean, unnamed copy of the original. So I'll go backwards here. I'm going to go ahead and click on the burger menu, choose Save As, and I'll call this Red Planner. And then I'll follow the steps to save it. With the closed cover complete, I'm ready to create my open planner background, which I'll do in the next video in this series. In the meantime, if you have any questions about what you learned in this one or any of the previous ones, please don't hesitate to let me know below. If you haven't seen the previous videos yet, you can find them here at the link on my channel. Thanks for watching.